Okay, welcome to Module 5. So in this module, we're looking at an analysis of financial statements, we're looking at ratios and benchmarking for cooperative performance. So the objective here is to make sure you have the ability to apply various forms of analysis to financial statements, to evaluate the operating performance of a company, and identify benchmarks for financial and non-financial performance of cooperatives. So ratio analysis, as with any business enterprise, it's important for cooperatives to evaluate their financial health. And these ratios are the same as would be used for investor-owned businesses. So you want, of course, to look at an organization's liquidity. So you're looking at the current ratio. So do you have enough assets, current assets, on hand to meet your current liabilities? If you don't, obviously it's going to be a problem. So coverage, you look at the debt to equity ratio. Activity, you're looking at inventory turnover. And profitability, you look at ratios here such as profit margin and return on investment. And it's important to know that in addition to these, like, quotes, regular ratios that all businesses use, there are ratios that are used by certain industries such as insurance and credit unions. So it's important to know how to calculate the ratios, but the really important thing is to understand what they are telling you about the co-op's financial health. So, for example, as I alluded to earlier, a poor current ratio means the cooperative doesn't have enough current assets to meet its current liabilities. So in that situation, it's very risky for the cooperative and its future. The other important thing to consider is looking at trend analysis. So look at your ratios over a number of years, just to look at the trends of whether the financial position of the cooperative is improving or if it's deteriorating. It's important to determine whether the trends are caused by external factors that cannot be easily controlled by the cooperative or by internal factors that can be addressed by management. Benchmarking. It's always important to be able to evaluate your organization compared to the industry in which it operates. So, for example, your own individual cooperative, it might look like it's really got a good performance because it's improving, and its trend analysis shows that it's improving year over year. However, if you compared it to the industry, maybe even though you're improving, you're still way worse than the industry. So that's where industry benchmarks come in handy. Unfortunately for cooperatives, unlike investor-owned companies, we don't really have market analysts that evaluate cooperatives' performance. The challenge is in finding comparable benchmarks. Some people say, well, it's important to compare to investor-owned businesses, like, comparing credit unions to banks, and certainly there's some merit in that, but there's probably more merit in comparing credit unions to other credit unions. And if you're comparing a cooperative to an investor-owned business, is this really a valid comparison when the underlying profit motivations are very different? So there's a really neat article that we include in this module by Ian Glassford. He was a VP of the large credit union in Western Canada, and he explores the concept of enough when evaluating cooperative performance versus pure profit maximization. Of course, cooperatives have to make a profit. They have to have enough to be a viable organization, but how much is enough? So he explores that. And it's important to evaluate the cooperative's health. Again, the challenge is finding benchmarks that's specific to the cooperative sector. And there's some industry benchmark sources listed in the lecture notes, But of course, it's not meant to be an all-inclusive, comprehensive list. I add to this every year as students point out more benchmarks in their own industry sectors. A lot of these industry benchmarks are private benchmark information, and then not everybody has the ability to access the information. So the Living Lab for this, here you have to use a cooperative other than your own employer. And the objective here is to find an industry standard or benchmark for at least 2 ratios in each of the following categories. So operating performance, liquidity, and financial strength. Make sure you respond to all the questions in the assignment. If you can't find a benchmark, then select a cooperative of a similar size in your industrial sector. And that concludes this module.